The night Margaret Hayes ran into the Tennessee wilderness was the night she stopped being a child. The cold air cut at her skin like broken glass as she stumbled through the dark trees, her breath shaking, her ribs aching where her father's fists had landed. Her thin dress clung to her bruised body, and every step hurt. But stopping meant dying at the hands of the man who had spent her whole life breaking her spirit piece by piece. 17-year-old Margaret had lived in fear for so long that fear itself felt like home. In Boone Station, no one questioned why Josiah Hayes's daughter kept her eyes down, why her arms were always covered, or why the fire in their cabin never seemed warm. Her father was a man ruined by failure, anger, and whiskey, and Margaret had paid the price for every disappointment he ever carried. She had survived by learning silence, by reading the sound of his boots before he opened the door, by memorizing the one loose floorboard that would give her away, by swallowing her cries so the wolves outside the cabin would not hear how helpless she was. But that night, everything changed. Josiah had come home with a dead look in his eyes, a look more terrifying than rage. He had been denied credit at the trading post, and the last strand of hope inside him had snapped. He didn't yell this time. He didn't curse. He only stared at her with a hollow hatred that chilled her blood. When he lifted his hand, Margaret knew he meant to end her life. A silent scream rose in her throat as she threw herself toward the door. She hit the wood so hard it nearly cracked, and then she was outside, swallowed by the freezing wind. She ran. The forest tore at her feet, the rocks cut her skin, branches whipped her cheeks, but she didn't slow. She didn't dare look back. If she looked back, she feared her legs would freeze and she would collapse. And then she would die. The moon lit the wilderness in a pale silver glow, turning the ridges into giants watching her flight. The land felt alive around her, wild and massive, as if it were making room for her to escape. For the first time in her life, she wasn't trying to survive someone else's anger. She was fighting for her own heartbeat. Her breath grew thin. The cold dug into her bones. She felt her strength slipping as she reached a frozen creek. The edges of her vision blurred. Her knees buckled. She collapsed on the icy ground, the stars spinning above her, her cheek pressed against the frozen earth. For a moment she felt almost peaceful. If death came now, it would be quiet. It would be gentle. It would be nothing like the life she had known. Her last thought before darkness swallowed her was of a small treasure hidden beneath a stone in her father's cabin, the smooth brown acorn her mother had once given her, the only proof she had ever been loved. Then everything went black. She woke to warmth, not the harsh heat of her father's fire, but a steady, gentle warmth that wrapped around her like a blanket. She smelled hickory smoke and cured meat, and something else, something clean and comforting. She lay on a bed of pine boughs covered with a heavy bear hide. She didn't dare open her eyes. For a moment, she thought she must be dreaming. No pain, no yelling, no cold, just silence, and the soft crackle of a hearth. But then a sound reached her, the slow, patient rhythm of someone stitching leather with a bone needle. Her eyes flew open. A man sat near a small fire. His silver hair was tied back, his shoulders broad despite his age. His face was carved with deep lines, not of anger but of years spent in the mountains. His pale blue eyes were calm, steady, and unlike any eyes she had ever known. They held no cruelty. When she tried to sit up, pain shot through her body, and she gasped. Instantly she froze in fear, expecting a blow. But the man didn't move. He didn't scold her. He didn't reach for her. He simply looked at her with quiet understanding. For Margaret, who had never been around a gentle man, his stillness was more frightening than rage. She pressed herself back into the furs, trembling. He spoke no words. He offered no questions. Instead, he returned to his stitching, as if giving her time to breathe. Over the next day, she saw how he worked. How he placed bowls of stew near her without watching her eat. How he applied salves to her wounds with careful, practiced hands. How he made himself small in his own cabin so she wouldn't feel trapped. He was a mountain man who lived alone. A widower, a survivor of his own sorrows, and he had saved her life. Yet Margaret sensed something strange, something deeper. The way he watched the forest. The way he looked at her with the quiet knowledge of someone who had been waiting a long time. As if rescuing her wasn't an accident. As if her arrival was a chapter he had known was coming. She didn't know his name yet, but soon she would learn it. And nothing in her world would ever be the same again. Nearly musical, so gentle it soothed. The fear still knotted inside her chest. She sat up slowly, every muscle aching, but the pain felt different now. It was the pain of healing, not the pain of being broken. The old mountain man was already awake. He moved around the small shelter with quiet purpose, tending to the fire, checking the traps he had laid the night before, preparing herbs on a flat stone. His presence filled the cabin, steady as a heartbeat. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, like gravel in a riverbed. "You're safe here." Just 3 simple words. But they struck Margaret harder than any blow ever had. Safe. She had never known what that felt like. He told her his name was Ezekiel Crane, a widower, a trapper, a man who had lived most of his life in the high ridges, far from the noise and trouble of Boone Station. He didn't tell her anything else, and she didn't ask. Not yet. For days he cared for her in silence. He cooked for her, dressed her wounds, and kept a respectful distance. He never touched her unless healing required it, and even then his hands were steady and careful, like a craftsman repairing something precious. Margaret did not understand kindness. Her body flinched when he approached, and her eyes stayed fixed on the ground whenever he spoke. She waited for the anger she had always known. She waited for the moment the gentle quiet would snap like a brittle twig. But it never did. Slowly, the fear inside her began to loosen. One afternoon, while Ezekiel prepared a poultice, Margaret's eyes drifted to the corner of the cabin. Her breath caught in her throat. Folded neatly on a wooden stool was a wool blanket, faded but unmistakable, a pattern of interlocking green and golden stars. She knew that pattern. It was the same one her mother used to wrap around her when she was small. It had been warm, soft, and scented with lavender. A memory so distant she had sometimes wondered if she had imagined it. She reached toward the blanket with a trembling hand. Ezekiel paused, watching her gently. Something deep and sorrowful flickered in his eyes. "That belonged to a friend," he said quietly, "a long time ago." Margaret clung to that single sentence. A friend, a blanket, a connection. For the first time since her mother's death, the world didn't feel so empty. When she was strong enough to walk, Ezekiel taught her simple tasks. How to identify yarrow leaves, how to move silently through brush, how to follow the way a hawk circles to find water. She learned quickly, trying with all her fragile strength to prove she was worth saving. But while she learned the mountains were learning her. Ezekiel watched her carefully, his gaze not judging but studying, as if trying to understand a piece of a puzzle that had sat unsolved for many years. One afternoon, when sunlight filtered through the hemlocks, Ezekiel returned from checking the spring with a troubled look. "The water's wrong," he muttered. "Tastes of metal. Not good." He prepared to climb to the ravine to search for the source of the contamination, but Margaret stopped him. She pointed toward a narrow side ravine and mimicked a landslide with her hands. Then she scraped a thin line in the dirt and touched it to her tongue, making a face. Ezekiel stared at her, surprised. "You saw something," he murmured. She nodded. She had remembered the small landslide she'd seen weeks ago while gathering firewood. A pointless detail then, now a clue. They followed her lead. The air grew heavier as they climbed, filled with the smell of iron. At the top, the truth revealed itself. The landslide had exposed a vein of red ore. Rainwater was running over the mineral and poisoning the spring. Ezekiel breathed out slowly, a deep awe filling his expression. "You saw what I didn't," he said softly. They built a diversion channel together, hauling logs and packing mud with their bare hands. Margaret's fingers bled, her back ached, and her breath came in ragged gasps. But she didn't stop. Each stroke of mud felt like reclaiming her life one handful at a time. When the clean water began to flow again, She felt a fire inside her, small but real, a fire she had never known before. Pride. As they returned to the hollow, tired but filled with quiet satisfaction, the forest felt different. More alive, more theirs. Margaret finally felt like she belonged somewhere. But the moment they stepped into the clearing, everything changed. A dark brown whiskey bottle lay in the dirt. Beside it, fresh hoofprints, 2 horses, shod hooves, deep prints, heavy men. Margaret's blood froze. Someone had found their sanctuary. Ezekiel stiffened, his face turning grim. The forest fell silent around them, as if holding its breath. Moments later, the silence shattered. 2 men rode into the clearing, reeking of whiskey and arrogance. Land speculators, loud, careless, and dangerous. They saw Ezekiel alone and dismounted with sneering confidence. They shoved him, mocked him, demanded information. Margaret watched from behind a rock, her body shaking as old terror clawed up her throat. The men talked about maps, hand-drawn, bought cheap in Boone Station, maps from a dead trapper, a trapper named Josiah Hayes. Her father. Margaret felt her stomach drop. Her father's greed had led them straight to her. Even dead, he was still destroying her world. Her fear turned to something sharper, colder, determination. When the men laughed at Ezekiel and called him a worthless old fool, she knew she had to act. She could not fight them with strength. But she knew something they didn't. Cruel men always believed themselves undefeatable. She moved silently, gathering white berries Ezekiel had once warned her about, berries that cause sickness, not death. Quickly, she cooked a small pot of stew, crushed the berries inside, and walked into the clearing, pretending to be a frightened, simple-minded girl. The men swallowed her lie as easily as they swallowed the poisoned stew. Minutes later, doubled over in agony and convinced the hollow was cursed, they fled in panic. The clearing fell silent again, but when Margaret looked at Ezekiel, expecting relief, she found something else in his eyes. Not fear of the men, fear for her. Fear of what she had learned to do to survive. He stepped toward her with sorrow in his voice. "What kind of world," he asked softly, "teaches a child to serve a meal with such quiet, perfect hatred?" The question broke something inside her. And for the first time in her life, she told someone the truth. She told him everything. The words poured out of Margaret like water breaking through a dam. Not smooth, not steady. Broken pieces of a life shattered long ago. She told Ezekiel about the cabin that smelled of whiskey and fear. About the nights she prayed not for rescue, but for the strength to disappear. About the beatings that came without warning. About the mother whose memory was fading except for the warmth of a single blanket. Ezekiel listened without interrupting. His pale eyes held no judgment, only a deep, aching sorrow. When she finally fell silent, trembling with exhaustion, he didn't try to comfort her with empty promises. Instead, he rose, disappeared inside the shelter, and returned holding a small carved bird. A tiny bluebird, smooth from age, its paint faded by time. He knelt and placed it gently into her hands. "I carved that for a newborn girl," he said softly. "Her mother brought her here many years ago. My wife loved that woman like a sister." Margaret's breath caught. He was talking about her mother, the woman she barely remembered, the only gentle part of her childhood. She felt the world tilt as the truth sank in. This place, this man, this refuge was not an accident. It was a circle closing after 17 long years. "You knew her," Margaret whispered. "I did," Ezekiel said. "She had a good heart, strong spirit. She learned healing from my Sarah Grace. She was meant for this life, not the one she was dragged into." Margaret clutched the bluebird to her chest, tears burning her eyes. For the first time, she didn't feel lost. She felt found. The hollow became her home in a way she never imagined. Days turned into weeks. She learned more about the mountains, about plants that healed and those that harmed. She gathered water from the spring she had helped save. She listened to Ezekiel's quiet stories and told him her own. She found peace, real peace, settling into her bones like warm sunlight. But peace is fragile. One crisp autumn morning, the sound of steady boots on gravel shattered their world. A single man stepped into the hollow. Not a drunk, not a thief, a surveyor. He carried maps, rolled tight and crisp, with the cold authority of the government behind him. With polite words and practiced distance, he unrolled a chart that sliced the mountains into neat black squares. Parcel 89. Their home, their sanctuary. He told them they had no legal right to remain. The land had been sold to a settlement company. Soon homesteaders would arrive. The hollow would be developed. Ezekiel and Margaret would have to leave. Ezekiel's shoulders sagged. A lifetime of losses weighed on him, and she saw resignation settle over him like frost. But Margaret was not resigned. Not this time. Not after everything she had survived. The next morning, before dawn, she wrapped a few belongings in her mother's blanket and stood before Ezekiel. No longer a frightened girl, but a young woman with a purpose burning bright inside her. "I'm going to Greenville," she said. "I'll find the Whitmores. I'll make them understand." Ezekiel looked at her with both pride and fear, but he didn't stop her. He only placed his weathered hand on her shoulder. "Your mother would be proud," he whispered. Margaret walked out of the hollow, heart pounding, fear stalking her steps. But she did not turn back. The settlement was loud, busy, and filled with hard faces. But Margaret kept walking, one step at a time, until she reached the newest building in town, Whitmore Land Office. Inside sat Samuel Whitmore, a man with a calm voice and kind eyes. He asked her what business she had with him, and for a moment her voice failed. Then she remembered the bluebird in her bundle. The truth was her only weapon. She told him the story of the hollow, of Ezekiel, of a life saved, of a peace that existed nowhere else in these mountains. She described the land not as property, but as a living place, a home built out of healing and survival. Then she placed the bluebird on his desk. "He carved this for me," she said. "My mother was your people's friend. This land is the last piece of her kindness left in the world." Silence filled the office. Samuel Whitmore stared at the small wooden bird, then at the young woman who had survived the unimaginable to be standing there. Slowly, he rolled up the map. "The hollow will remain untouched," he said quietly. "No fence will cross it. No deed will claim it." Margaret felt her knees weaken with relief. But then he said something that changed her life forever. "You speak both languages," he said, "the mountains and ours. Help me build a settlement that treats your people with respect. Stay, be our healer, be our bridge." Margaret didn't make her choice for herself. She made it for Ezekiel, for the mountains, for the wounded souls who needed someone who understood both sides. She accepted. Years passed. Cedar Valley grew, not perfect, but better than most places. Margaret became known as the Bridge Woman. People came to her for medicine, for counsel, for peace. She visited the hollow often. Ezekiel grew older, his back bent with time, but his eyes always brightened when she walked through the trees. One summer evening, he gave her a final gift, a medicine bundle once belonging to Sarah Grace. "She believed you were the one," he said. "A healer born of two worlds." Margaret finally understood her destiny. She had not been saved to hide. She had been saved to heal, to mend wounds in people the way she had once mended poisoned water, to calm storms the way she had calmed her own fear, to build peace the way she rebuilt her own life. Her name was never carved into a monument, but her legacy lived in every family that found safety in Cedar Valley, in every child who grew up without fear, in every mountain person who finally had a place to belong. She had been beaten, broken, hunted, and lost, but a widowed mountain man had rescued her, and she had changed not only her destiny, but everyone else's.